I'd like to inform you that this event is being recorded, okay? And I would like
Recording
to
in
invite
progress.
you, and I would like to invite you to switch your cameras on if you would like, of course. So welcome to this last event of the project, Post-Apocalyptic Encounters. And yeah, for this last event, we have the collective Living Midnight Narrative Outfit as our guests. And the project Post-Apocalyptic Encounters has been a series of events, both online and offline, that gathered people interested in ways of thinking, living, and creating that stem from non-Eurocentric bodies of knowledge. So in the month of September, we had some workshops, some movement workshops in a few cities in Germany that were led by me, Corina Cordova, and Bianca Mendonça, that is another initiator and curator of the project, who unfortunately cannot be here today because her daughter was born today. And then in October, this series of online encounters started. So, and today we are closing with this encounter. So welcome you all. So this session, this first part, when Living Midnight will be having a conversation and showing us a few things to last about 50 minutes, more or less. And then we'll give a sign to when we will open the conversation to all of you. And then the second part will last maximum 30 minutes, could be less. Of course, it depends on all of you. And during this 30 minutes, we're going to invite everyone to either comment or ask questions, share references, I mean, whatever you would feel like contributing with. And I would like to also invite you to extend this response to the event also to next days or a couple of weeks, because also one of the, let's say, aims of this project is to have like an archive of knowledge that will be hosted in our website, no, postapocalypticencounters.com, and everything will be ready probably by the end of January 2023. And as documentation of each encounter, we would like to also include contributions from everyone that participated, either as our guests or just, let's say, as spectator participants. So you are invited to send us things maybe through the chat or also later until the end of the year via email. So, and it could be in any mode or form. It could be a text, it can be an image, it can be sound. Yes, so that if you would like to have your contribution included in the documentation, you're very, very welcome to do so. And okay, so, and I am Corina Cordova. I am a choreographer and dancer and researcher. I also work as a dance dramaturg. I am originally from São Paulo, Brazil, and I am currently based in Stockholm, Sweden. And in this project, I am one of the initiators and curators, together with Bianca Mendonça, who I mentioned that could not be here today. And Bianca, she is a choreographer and a researcher in the field of performing arts. And she is also originally from Brazil, and she's based in Cologne, in Germany. And the other initiator of the project is here today. That's Lena Peters. Hey, Lena.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Yeah, my name is Lena. I'm from Germany originally, but currently I live in Lisbon in Portugal. And in this project, I'm responsible for the documentation and the production. And I'm a dancer, a dramaturg, a cultural producer, and a teacher.
Okay, thank you, Lena. And so, our guests today, they work together as Living Midnight narrative outfit and narrative outfit. And they're Ankita Trivedi, Ishita Jain, and Thomas Michael. So, and LMNO is an award-winning speculative design and research collective. Since its inception in India in late 2018, LMNO has worked towards speculative projects through a practice of experimental pedagogy, resulting in site-based exhibitions. Currently, they are working on a speculative futures research and documentation project, Sites of Indie Futurisms, Traditional Indian Board Games. The project is supported by the Graham Foundation in the US. And they're a collision of wisdom produced through the bodies of three shapeshifters. And on the earthly realm, they manifest as Ankita, Ishita, and Thomas. So Ankita Trivedi is a futurist and design academic with an expertise in speculative narrative environments. And her current doctoral research examines fictioning. What happened there? Okay. Fictioning as a process for the production of chimeric subjectivities, surreal landscapes, and entangled object-body space ecologies in a mythopoetic Indian backdrop through science fiction films, medieval archives, and totemic objects. Ishita Jain is an artist scholar and architectural historian working on affective learning environments and mythopoetic theater. Her current doctoral project looks at affective production of future environments in pastoral and heritage-bound ecologies in lower Himalayas in India, arguing for a temporal analysis for spatial intervention through vegetal ontologies. Thomas Michael is a process philosopher working on transdisciplinary design research for re-enchanting landscapes. And from his original thesis at Harvard on Blade Runner urbanisms to courses that were recent taught on science fiction futures, he proposes that science fiction condenses subjectivity, technology, and desires in the immediate futures. Okay, so now I invite our guests to start. And thank you everybody for being here. Just enjoy.
Thank you, Karina and Lena, for that introduction for LMNO. We're broadcasting you today from Gujarat in India. In our conversation, we will be splicing in some animations, brief animations to explain perhaps some of the hidden secrets of the firm. And we'd like to start with the first one right now, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. Great. So let's explore the relationship between science fiction and design futures. Perhaps we can begin by pointing out that designers have an affinity towards science fiction in the sense that designers, although they might operate in the present, are always planning for things in the near future. And as a consequence, by jumping ahead to science fiction as the distant future and pulling it back in time, backcasting as it were to the present, we have great opportunities to reinterpret emerging technologies before they actually emerge. One example I can think of from my own research when I started down this path was how Ridley Scott brought in the industrial designer Sid Mead to help develop the direction for the stage sets for the film Blade Runner, which was a mixture of film noir and science fiction. We know that science fiction and design both operate with a strong degree of modernist technological determinism, where the technology changes everything beyond the realm of the technical. And we can think of also Marshall McLuhan's 4 Laws of Media that points out that nothing ever truly emerges out of nothing, and nothing ever totally disappears, but we have processes where things become obsolescent and come back into play much later in new forms and new variations. Something to also think about in relationship to science fiction design is the ability for technologies themselves, even if they're discrete artifacts or objects, to be spatialized and temporalized. That is to say, they create chronotopes, they create own little micro worlds, and they start to have deformations, waves of influence, cascading into potentially, as my sociologist friends say, the law of unintended consequence. So much of science fiction draws from at least the moral hazards of these technologies in its early 20th century phases. We can also start to think of it in terms of perhaps not the individual technologies, but their collective operations. Mumford called the idea of the extraction culture from the medieval period to imperialism itself a mechanosphere. And in the late 20th century, we have theories of the biosphere, which does not have isolated entities in biology, the noosphere, which says there are no isolated consciousnesses, and Elemeno's unique contribution to this, the aerosphere. And with that, I'd like to ask Ishita if she can help expand this.
Thank you for that introduction, Thomas. And I'd sort of just extend the conversation here and go back to my childhood and, simultaneously even to Ankita's, who I know quite well, of having shared interests in science fiction narratives. And both of us actually grew up on very different kinds of science fiction, both in terms of what we read and what we saw. And they almost shaped our imagination. And this is a realization we have had only in the past 6 months when we began to work with science fiction in a more rigorous and, perhaps an academic way as well. And this happened with an opportunity that came through the Governing Design Group, which is a collective of researchers and artists, and quite like your interdisciplinary collective, collaboration between the Concordia University and parts of design school in Brussels, and they sent out a call that literally asked, "How does the South design?" And this was in relationship to resilience, that they were seeking answers to that. And we went back to the science fiction archives to look for imaginaries of the future. And at that time, I remember both Ankita and we found there's an anthology of science fiction, which just came out in 2018, right, Ankita? And we were quite taken by the variety of narratives, and variety not in relation to themselves, but variety in terms of the differences of approach to storytelling that these narratives sort of showed us. Yeah. And then we followed that up with the book review.
Yeah. But I think what the Golan's book, so it was called the Golan's Book of South Asian Fiction, and it had contributions from India, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, and from Sri Lanka. So we were also, I think, for the first time, contending with context that was similar to ours, but also slightly different, dealing with similar issues, but also they were strange in very, very familiar ways. What we were really, really interested in seeing after having read both of those volumes, which were edited by a very famous person called Tarun K. Saint, but also had contributions from a lot of female authors like Manjula Padmanabhan, Vandana Singh, Sukanya Datta, as well as Payal Dhar. And we found that the work of these women specifically, coming from very, very different kinds of contexts within the Global South, had a lot of relationality and granularity of everyday practices that merge with science fiction. And we thought, wow, this is such an, because we read it as, science fiction enthusiasts, but we also read it as designers. All three of us at some level or the other have been involved in spatial design as, through our education, through practice, or through teaching. So the environments, the worlds, the symbols that we could see, which had, lots of, which also, I think, challenged a lot of our biases, Ishita, if you remember that conversation we were having.
But also, I remember we were so, it was really good for us to find, for example, Vandana Singh, who also was a physicist and, professor of physics and a housewife and an author. And, there she was writing this brilliant science fiction, right? And similarly, Manjula Padmanabham, who's a science fiction author, but a graphic designer, and her work is more into sort of, children's science fiction, moving on to, that's her specialty. So we also, that made it so easy for us to understand what Darko Suvin called the novum, right? That where do stories come from, and these set of stories sort of were very good sites of demonstration that stories are fragments from worlds that we live in, to worlds that we imagine, to worlds that have previously existed, and all of them coming together through series of networks and associations that, these people as authors make. And in that sense, even it sort of led us to question how much of these stories are written by these authors and how much of these stories are written by the world in its most expansive sense, that way, right? And then a couple of months later, when we were commissioned by the Science Fiction Research Association to write the book review of yet another author, which was just an anthology of all the science fiction works that were written since 2000. And I'd just like to share my screen and show you a map that we had made. And I'll just talk through that. I hope you can see my screen.
Yep.
And so here are these, larger categories within which Sami Ahmed Khan is reviewing the science fiction works since 2000. And Ankita, do you remember when we were reading through his discussions of the others? And, the mythic characters that we were so used to, like Betals, they became zombies. And
I think what he did really well is what we call, so he looked at a series of, this is for his book, Star Warriors. And one of the things that beyond structuring the series of works under this tripartite structure, what came across really well, like what Ishita said, was that motifs like Hindu gods or, Islamic angels, Indian clone generals. So he looked at works that sort of co-opted all of these Western or global pop culture influences, such as time travel or aliens, faster than light travel, bioengineered superhumans, but sort of combine that with a very, very local, what we call masala, that makes it very uniquely local, and offers almost a critique of both the global conversations that are happening in science fiction, but also very much the local context, which is, mainly, so Sami Ahmed looked at a lot of narratives which were based in India, and just a lot of Indian nationalist politics, Indian, the gender conversations happening in India.
I also remember in this, sorry to cut you off, but this collusion that you sort of pointed out, in that space, we also realized that something new was bubbling, right? I mean, suddenly zombies were not just simple undeads.
Yeah.
But, that they had been resuscitated through mantras and hymns and, sacrificial rites.
Yeah.
And the idea of technology became so much more expansive, which offered us one of the insights about moving away from the technological determinism that science fiction typically occupies, right?
But what was really interesting was what I was initially saying about the fact that it positioned itself really nicely within India's reality, the polyphonic and the very plural reality that is there today. And all of these narratives were sort of caught between, a mixture of folklore, fantasy, mythology, technology, but also, contemporary science facts that were prevalent between the 2000s and 2020. So,
and I remember actually how he ends the book talking about human choices and agencies. Playing a major role in the discussions of the kind of futures that we would have, right? And that resonated and kept alive these ways of bringing design to science fiction, right? Because science fiction looks to the future and designers are expected to look to the future. And strangely, through our experience in design education, we have experienced that it's a future that typically in design, the future comes after the present. Whereas in science fiction, it doesn't always have to. And, you know, that sort of opened up that space for us that, you know, what if we occupy those alternate timelines, and then what would happen?
This sounds a lot like thinking about constructs of time and space in a much more recombinant matter, with temporality or times or moments or even scenes being out of time or out of sequence. Ankita, you also called it plural reality, where science fiction is no longer just a trinity of human, post-human, and alien, but includes, if I've got everything correctly, reanimated zombies, Muslim angels, gender switching divinities, all freely operating and transgressing the laws of time and space, perhaps as generators of new paradigms, but new narratives too. I'm very curious if you can think of some films, or one film each perhaps, that exemplifies these characteristics of the plurality, or science facts becoming science fiction, that have been influential or striking for either of you.
I think I'll talk a lot because what's currently what you can see within the global pop culture phenomenon, which I am a very big fan of, that the conversation of the multiverse and meeting your own multiple selves in very different dimensions is becoming more prevalent. So not just with the MCU, with its shows like Loki or films like Spider-Man No Way Home or Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, but also the most very, very wonderful genre-defying sci-fi film like Everything Everywhere All at Once, or the frankly animated, amazing animated TV show that is Rick and Morty, or the mind-bending German drama that is Dark, or Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. So I think the wild possibilities of infinite universes give a very, very different angle to looking at plurality, looking at alterity, and in a lot of ways, multiple identities across space and time. But I'd like to come back and talk a little bit about Loki, because what's really interesting there is the timekeepers, or the TVA, which is the Time Variance Authority, which protects the sacred timeline, or what we would call the grand narrative. And it deposits all the variants or interlopers or transgressors who sort of challenge the conventions of that timeline, either via behavior, via appearance, or gender, are deposited in a collapsing reality, a space outside of space-time, where they, reckon with their alterity and the consequences of going against the grand narrative amongst themselves. And I think those conversations give a very, very interesting insight into how does at least the West handle plurality? I think, Ishita, you might have a better example within Indian science fiction.
Well, not better, but, definitely perhaps different enough to add a little bit of conversation here. I was thinking about the story that we discovered through the book Star Warriors, called Signal Red. And it's a story which is set in the forests of Madhya Pradesh. And again, it's a story in 3 structure, and, each structure pays a closer attention to one protagonist. There's Gopal, and then there's Anu, and then there's somebody called Rahil Vidyadhar, one who is a scientist that has been co-opted by corporation, which is also a state, right? And that's a reality that is so near that it's here. And, and this oscillation between the two gets even more palpable with the entrance of Anu, who comes to the forest from outside, but almost behaves like a conscience for Gopal. And the conversations that she has with Gopal, who's an old school friend, act as a mirror and enable Gopal to see himself again. And when he sees himself again, he sees all, not just his actions, but the multiple participations that he's had with the world. And I was thinking of, that form of alterity where your multiple selves do not necessarily manifest as a new body, or but almost as new set of relations, or already the multiple sets of relations that you've had with the world at different points of time in your life.
Yeah.
And in that sense, then alterity also exists outside of us, but it also exists through us. That's something what I was thinking about.
Yeah.
This idea of multiplicity keeps coming back, and also code switching and jumping around. And I think our second animation also hints at some of the significance of multiplicity. So could we roll the second animation, please? Okay, so I'd like to take the conversation to another aspect of LMNO. There's a phrase that I've heard you use quite a few times, and I'll ask Ishita this, if you can help unpack the neologism when you say it's about seeing the world new for the millionth time, which I think also ties into our sense of multiplicity.
Yeah, it ties to a sense of multiplicity, but it also, for me, is about tending and attending and, being intimate with the world, right? And paying very close attention, not just to the world, but what the world does back. So this continuous dance that we perform with the world as the world dances back with us. And in that dance, new sensorium emerges. So if your sensorium is becoming new all the time, then you never see the world twice. You always see it once, again and again and again, right? And in that, there's a deep sense of wonder that accompanies that scene. But there's also a humility that comes with being comfortable with the lack of knowledge. The seeing the world again and again for the first time is also an act of learning not to have control, because you don't know what you're controlling. And then one is there in the world as themselves, and they see the world as itself. And that's what we really mean. So, as Living Midnight, the way for us to do this is, when we see something, we tell a story about it. And I'm also remembering a conversation that I had with my supervisor. Like, if you tell a story, it will become new. If you write it down, it will never change. And, there's also that kind of orality and memory and, letting a story take its course and run away. And it has, it runs away sometimes with us, and sometimes it leaves us behind. Yep. And sometimes we run away and suddenly the story is not there.
Ankita, let me ask you about that, because you've also shown us through the animations, I think, the profoundly multimodal way that narratives occur. Your work in the firm doesn't specifically follow any of the guidelines. You never stay in your lanes, perhaps, in terms of how, what, where, why. So I'm just curious if you can explain the thrill or the drive that makes that happen recurrently.
Yeah, I think the drive, it comes back to the idea of stories. When me and Ishita, we met and we became friends about 15 years ago because of our shared love for a story, which is, if there are any Harry Potter fans here. And it was that shared love for a story that brought us together. And when we after, a series of events where we've grown together across the years, when we met again in 2018 to say that, let's actually start a firm, or let's actually start a conversation about what is it that we can do with this, interest and the need to tell stories, as many stories as possible. How do we go about it? And we weren't people who were interested in a cause. We weren't people who were interested in talking about one topic. What we were interested was in, telling stories in multiple mediums. And that kind of an aggregate feature to Living Midnight is why, we essentially find it very, very difficult to define ourselves, and have in the last year or more started calling ourselves shapeshifters, because every project brings with it, and what the animations actually also describe is the fact that this happens to us, this transformation, because the tree is effectively the three of us in very, very different modalities. We change and we transform because we allow projects to do that to us. And oftentimes, once we are done with it, we are somebody else by the end of it, and somebody else again in the beginning. So that ability to be
this additive nature, which comes both naturally, and then, over the last 2-3 years, we have actually had to learn how to work with it, right? Because it goes out of control.
Yeah, but we've always been very multi-limbed, similar to the divinities that we have.
Yeah.
But
Two
don't you
hands are
think
not enough.
that is also this additive nature is also what we were talking about, this multi-limb nature, that out of all these limbs that we have, at least one of them would know how to deal with science fiction, right? Yeah. And we'd have one set of eyes somewhere that could see things. Because I remember you struggled a lot, like, do I need to unlearn? Do I need to come out of my Western science fiction abyss?
Yeah, because and even though I know that we need to acknowledge, and I do also simultaneously think about science fiction critically. There's just something about this pop culture phenomenon which allows for an accessible and a universal language. Right. So today I can see a film in the MCU and go online, and I can connect to a community of individuals across the world who may have access to the similar vocabulary, similar visual language, and talk to them about these things. And one of the things that I do currently with the shift that we've had in reckoning with our own biases, with looking at Indian science fiction, is that I need new containers. Because even today, when I'm reading something that's Indian, very, very contextual, having been here all my life, there is still the first visual jump that it makes to a kind of a language, a visual language that is very, very Western. And also with the preconceived notions that I have of, Indian locals, or, the way genders are, because those are the things to contend with. And there's some synthesizing, but there's also a churning. So it has to be a very conscious effort for me currently to sort of move away from things which are very, very set in the imagination, to try and imagine something that's newer. And I don't think erasure, and we've talked about this, erasure is not the way, but some way of pulling.
I'm recalling some of the chips that have multiple cores in them as that became popular, so that parallel processing could occur, giving some command system the ability to jump, signal shift, or jump across the parallel transversely. But I'm also recalling, and people are starting to see this now, the first few times I eavesdropped on LMNO conversations, it was a head-spinning experience, because it sounds like you guys are speaking in tongues when you get really excited. I recognized English, Hindi, Gujarati, primal screams, inappropriate sexual innuendo, a lot of cackling, gibberish, and I've started to make a taxonomy of the nonsensical ground for the production of sense that comes out of those works. But I'm curious if that's a deliberate process that you're highlighting, because we're starting to see this recurring, this multiplicity of tongues, multiplicity of limbs, multiplicity of media. And is that LMNO?
I think it is LMNO, but it's also all three of us individually. And, only very recently, I think we are beginning to realize how when the three of us come together, it becomes a compound, right? And Tina and if Bianca was here, it was when we were discussing this conversation, we realized that LMNO is a super being. So, and that one's gonna stick, the idea of three beings producing a super being. So, that's going to add to all our epic narratives. But this idea of having access to multiple languages is also something that has allowed us to think of multiple spaces that are possible within what exists. Because the reason for having these multiple languages is the kind of access we have had. Like English was a formal language of, education. But then we grew up in multilingual households. And, parents speak different language, both set of parents speak different languages. Then there's, for Hindi, there's Bollywood production and, but then there's design as a language. There's visual language that comes from, the kind of exposure we have had to visual arts. Both of us are trained classical dancers, and, from there comes a sense of performative as a language.
Like an aesthetic knowledge base as well.
Yeah. So
because we've also grown together as designers, as people, as women, who also, went to London and came back with a set of things that to figure out. So there's also exposure, which is similar, but also quite different. And we saw that when you came in with your stories and your exposure, how that sort of, merged with the clunked up, structure that we are, and we're not sure if we're a skyscraper or we're an underground bunker or, we're a mind palace. So we're discussing these different typologies of who we are, but it's
the typology that you are today is the tree, and I'm reminded that it's time for our next animation because we want to unpack some of these leaky containers. So could we run the next animation?
Yep.
Yeah.
So we heard some provocations there concerning everything from shifts and folds and unfolding into passages, movement systems implied and created. But I'd like to go back to perhaps a little more of an insightful question. Is there such a thing as too many narratives? What's with the deal with all of this collecting and hoarding? Why is there this infinite desire to keep producing narratives?
I think I'll talk about one of my favorite, within the feminist world building conversation, what Ursula Le Guin says about the carrier bag theory of fiction, where she sort of, talks about removing the earliest tool that was a spear to, replacing it with the receptacle or a kind of the collective, or like the carrier bag, which sort of looks at shifting our foundations from things which are about conquering, but to shifting it to things which are about gathering, holding, and sharing. So going by that kind of a logic, we kind of like to talk about Living Midnight as almost this jumbled mess of stories that holds things which are entangled, which are complex, which are contradictory, which have differences, but in simultaneity, they're conflicted as well, but also very, very unapologetic about it. And, combining this with Haraway's idea about string figures and speculative fabulation, which talks about, actually stringing these pieces within the bag together to make sense of the world more relationally, to make sense with kin, with new kin, as opposed to, being individual spears launching out into the universe and landing flat somewhere. I don't know. So,
but that also, so you bringing up Haraway also, takes me back to our earlier conversation about science and, how in the most well-known science fiction narrative, science only appears at the moment of destruction or at the moment of collapse or, at the moment of the apocalypse. Suddenly, like there's apocalypse and, science is going to come in and solve everything. Yeah. And this is science that comes at the hands of the military, or this is the science that comes at the hands of a, rich white dude who can type on the computer. This is the science that comes, at the hands of the state. And I think one of the reasons, if you just think of the question that you asked, Thomas, about, why this need to tell so many stories. And if we pin it down to today's conversation as well, just today's conversation, then perhaps telling stories would, allow us to rescue science from governments and from military industrial complex and, situate it and locate it to a more citizen science imagination,
Or kind of less epistemologies where there's a more welcome, inclusive
Yeah, and you know, ideas of alternate sciences, which lets you focus on, say, someone like Vandana Shiva's work, who is a philosopher, quantum physicist, and a Gandhian. And, you know, she is using her quantum physics interrelation worldview to protect seeds for the future, right? She is also thinking about the future. And she is taking on the corporate giants who want to have an intellectual property right over seeds of the world. And her project is to use science to rescue from that science, right? And it's about telling multiple stories, stories of a science, say, that is for a neurodivergent, stories of science that is for the homeless, you know, when you make inflatable homes, stories of science that is for architecture, you know, when you say plant a piece of moss in a concrete. And that's why we need to tell as many stories as possible all the time.
I think there's also something, every time you said science, I heard the undertone of the word design in there. And we can also expand that to think about, you know, not just design after capitalism, but look at alternatives like the pluriverse. I'm quite fascinated. Ankita, you've been working on some course outlines, I think, that are due in a couple of hours. I was wondering if you could, in the few minutes we have before the next animation, pull it back down to the fine grain level of reality and talk about, you know, the pedagogy of fictioning and how that works in perhaps in speculative design.
Yeah, I think India, from my experience of, you know, conducting several now design fiction and design future courses across Bangalore, Pune, and Ahmedabad, India is still a little slow on the uptake when talking about speculative design. Because they are more, they continue to be more concerned about sort of studios and courses that would lead towards, you know, industry-led conversations, or, you know, students are more interested in where they're getting placed after that, after their degree is done. So getting them to sort of leave aside the idea of functionality, use, and purpose, things which are very, very capitalist and, you know, at the offset, and think about new realities, new ways of being, new objects, you know, new lived experiences. And that conversation has been a bit slow going in a lot of ways. And it's very, very directed towards, you know, industries of product design and UI, UX and innovation. They're not really interested in, you know, how fashion changes, or how, you know, they're not interested in interdisciplinarity, which is, I think, a huge sense of loss at the moment, because worlding is relational and interdisciplinary and, you know, connected. You cannot think about it in disciplinary silos. And that's one of the things that's, you know, happening pedagogically within the design education sector.
So even those prior design disciplines are leaky.
Yes, they really need to be leaky.
But it's also making me think of the figure of the gatekeepers. You know, it seems like there are just too many gatekeepers, and perhaps the most dangerous gatekeepers in design educations are the ones that are in charge of this, you know, language. They are not letting this language of articulation, imagination, and does any kind of transformation grow, right? Because with new language, and birth of language, in fact, if you think about it, follows a resistance, but also brings a rebellion with it. So I understand why it is so dangerous and why so much of resources, so many resources are sort of directed to protecting the world order, you know, because when Thomas, you mentioned pluriverse, you know, I was thinking about how Escobar and his colleague Enzio Manzini, when they are discussing ontological design, Manzini comes up with an interesting phrase. He says, design designs. And that's a question that we don't ask, you know, and I have not seen that question being asked in the Indian education, actually, Indian design education, that how does what you design the world back, right? Yeah. So I think we are, that's what, for me, that's the crucial thing we're missing.
I think I'd like to bring out the question you mentioned earlier, Ursula K. Le Guin, who's come back into fashion for a variety of reasons. Not less Haraway's turn to her for understanding how a forest can be something much more than the trees that make it. And I think that also is our clue to run our next animation, if we have ready to go.
Yep.
Okay, so given the range of insights we've had so far across design, myth, technology, alien intelligences, speaking in tongues, and a variety of, I guess, fascinating parallel processes and multiplicities, probably too many to be counted. What happens when LMNO gets what it's asking for?
You want to take that?
Yeah, I remember when we got the email from Graham saying we got that grant, we both called each other, screamed.
I don't think we believed it for a while.
No, we screamed, we danced around a little bit, and then we were like, how are we going to do this? Because, and I think we learned from that, because this time, Ankita, I think just today morning, she was saying that when we come to a project, we adopt it for a really long time. So right now, the project is in our imagination for at least the next 5 years, but it's going to stay for the lifetime because of what it's going to do to us. So, and even though we've been seeking support in the form of, when we proposed a pedagogical exercise to the South Designs call, or, we ended up talking about it at a conference, or, we are getting deeper into the archives of the Global South Science Fiction through either book reviews or conference papers. But we are also seeking communities like this. And, when we heard from, when we saw your post on Facebook, instead of, say, on a fancy website, or, on things like HNet or eFlux, it was an alternative space for us to come to you and, write that proposal. And that itself was an exploration, that itself was one of the things we would do and we want to do if we get what we are asking for, which is, how do we find people who are doing things that we want to do, and, hold conversations about how are you doing it, and, what can we do with, and, how can we share and exchange. So, finding those hidden allies and support and community is one. But I also know that this time around, we're also more mindful of who else is doing this better than us right now.
Which are the better superheroes? So, because we've been working on the model of being waiters in the morning and superheroes and vigilantes by night, right? So the waiter is paying the super suit at the moment. So one of the ways that we also want to try and learn from others is that, is somebody else making your super suit who's your tailor, when you guys hang out, do you exchange, do you like go to a pub and meet with, these are my vigilante rules and these are your vigilante rules? Can we have like an emergency code that if I need backup, you will be there? So,
Hey, thrift stores for super suits, that'd be nice.
That'll be nice. Yeah. That'll be nice that,
I think you should get the designer from The Incredibles. She was just amazing, the one who made all the suits. Just put her on retainer. So what are the access points? I mean, you just mentioned all these sleeper cell hidden communities and potential supporters, which are probably hopefully self-identifying in the future. But what are the access points? How do they get to know about you? How do they get to know, through the narratives or through this tree of multiplicity? How do they get to know about LMNO?
Hey, first and foremost, hi, we are LMNO to all of you out there. This is one way of doing it.
That's one.
That's one, right? And this is the line of, telling stories. So, every time we are invited to tell a story about us, we'll go and do it. And, the figure of this mendicant or a bard who has an instrument and goes from place to place and does nomadic storytelling, that image is quite alive in our subconscious. So that is one. Second is learning from how people are doing it. So one, I know, Ankita, you are a big fan of the Wakanda Dream Lab.
Yeah. It's actually really great, and it brings me back again to the conversation about having a universal language, right? So Wakanda Dream Lab, to those who may not have heard of it, is a collective. It's a fan-driven project, and what it does is it sort of it bridges the worlds of Black fandom and activism for Black liberation. But what they do is they use the pop culture appeal of Wakanda, the entire world building that went into the creation of Black Panther, and they use that as a cultural strategy and talk about design. They talk about curation. They talk about production of immersive storytelling campaigns that lead to social impact. And they're all very, very future facing, similar to going by, and they analyze what they've been doing recently through their podcasts, workshops, and curriculums is sort of pulling apart the world of Wakanda to sort of understand appearances, understand gender, and how they've been empowering certain narratives within that. How much of the African history are they actually drawing from? And what are the nuances there within that world that talk about, pulling those things out into the reality and doing something really interesting and wonderful with it. And I think that's what I want to eventually achieve through the Indian science fiction or the global South science fiction conversation as well, that if it's out there, if it's in the visual medium, if it is, if it has the same reach, like say Black Panther does, then it's possible for us to sort of use Indian science fiction to, just open up a whole new, boxes of hope, optimism.
But that also reminds me of another conversation we were having about stories being present in multiple mediums, right? Because each medium offers a space for unraveling. So Black Panther as a comic book, and Black Panther as a graphic novel, and Black Panther as a film, and all the posters, the visual media, and then the making of Black Panther, and each of them were just different spaces for the same story to be told in a different way, right? It was them seeing Black Panther for the first time, again, a millionth time, right? That's how you do it. And so yeah, we definitely, but I also think that we'd have to be part of the group of people to first and foremost create that vocabulary, because that vocabulary is not present to be to be I don't want to say appropriated, but to be used. It's not pre-existing. So there is a lot of work.
We need to leverage it. And I think one of the ways, because we've also realized in the past 6 months that despite India and Global South having such a rich legacy of literary works in science fiction that encourage these, visions of the future that are relational, that are, bringing together science with the everyday, they're not necessarily the springboards for designers, which I think is a huge room for us to think about within design education.
Hey, that reminds me that, we discussed the genealogy of science fiction from literature to film, and how the Hollywood complex absorbs the designers of the West Coast into the production of Hollywood science fiction, and why Bollywood is not a clone and cannot clone it. In the same way, perhaps, that Afrofuturism cannot be Indofuturism for all those reasons. And I'm thinking about, what about, aside from text-based science fiction or film-based science fiction, what about object-based science fiction? Can you imagine having an exhibition of impossible objects from the future? Because we've already seen that in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., in Tenet. That's already a future reality that's been backcast onto us, or even your guys' project on the Museum of Impossible Objects, or obsolete objects. And so maybe that's another realm to think about too, that designers would not have to start with the text or the film, but start with the object itself.
Yeah, that's the whole design fiction narrative, right? That we try either go from the object to the world, or come from the world to the object. So, and that is something that we've seen a lot within, like you said, in Hollywood, and the Silicon Valley, merger that happened with, say, Kubrick's, video.
2001.
Yeah, 2001 and Space Odyssey becoming Skype and iPads, or, Star Trek's tricorder, which had geolocation, communication and transportation became, eventual flip phones. So I think there's definitely a room for that kind of a conversation within the Indian science fiction as well.
But
and
I'm
we see a lot
also,
of work.
a part of me is kind of glad that, that thing doesn't yet exist. I mean, glad for the fact that for the time at which we are entering this conversation.
Yeah.
Because within our context, people have not yet learned to do it badly.
Yeah.
So, we can get into that conversation at a time when there's room to, fail and make mistakes and, start a conversation. And, with an awareness that, we can't replicate the same genealogy, or we can't replicate the Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and science futures relationship, because we've all seen how that one goes. So there's an opportunity, and that's where I think, and we have not yet discussed this, but I think it might be to just seek more and more grassroots communities, right? It might be in how, Ankita, you go and, you teach these studios.
Yeah.
And, maybe find a student or two to join the cause and keep moving.
I'm thinking perhaps to summarize that, the way Archigram started as a group of disgruntled designers, that's the myth, collaborating on subversive, unresolved low-res projects, blending pop culture and science fiction that later became canonical visionary work. But in the early stages was more of that searching or that exploring. And in that tone, I'd also think we should queue up our last animation, which is specifically on this topic of where to go to next. Great. And I think at this point, I should just see if Karina, Lena, and the rest of the audience is still with us. It'd be a great time to perhaps widen the conversation and extend the network.
Yes, yes. So that's the moment I mentioned before. So if anybody would like to join, it can be, of course, I mean, you can write in the chat or you can speak, of course. So it is up to you.
Also, if you feel not comfortable to just unmute and start talking, then just put your name in the chat and then we can call you if you want to say something.
I can also start, just maybe to break the ice. It's right in the beginning, I think it was Thomas, when you talked about, you were talking about the biosphere,
mechanosphere, biosphere,
exactly.
noosphere, aerosphere.
But you said that LMNO talked about the aerosphere.
Yes.
It did, like from Eros, I mean, from the
Yes, yes. That's a project.
I'm going to drop a link. I'm going to drop a link.
Yeah, because I kept that, like, because I wrote it down and then I didn't connect it. Okay. I mean, sure, please drop a link. And I mean, if you would like to say anything about it. I mean, I was curious with that. I was also, yeah, there was something also that I'm not so familiar with, but then I connected to something else, and I don't know if it's related to the aerosphere because it was within the same moment. You talked about, like, I think it was the 4 laws of media, and the way you described it to me, I really connected basically with laws of chemistry in a way that you described.
That's interesting, because the laws of media, McLuhan's laws of media, were media forms don't disappear, and his narrative is pretty well known as the basis for media studies. You know, the according to Victor Hugo, the novel destroys the cathedral by absorbing all of its functions, and television absorbs the novel, so that you don't have novels anymore. You have telenovelas and dramas and soap operas. And so what he was saying was this very Hegelian march towards a teleological future, where each media form absorbed, almost in an evolutionary way, its prior media forms, but many of them get negated or suppressed, also very Hegelian, only to reappear later, like a return of the repressed. So for him, it became very much a tracking device. It's interesting you pointed out his chemistry, because I'd never heard that equation before. Whereas the aerosphere, in my understanding, and I think we should talk about the project, but the mechanosphere as a principle was well established with the machine age as a term and as a conceptualization of the world becoming entirely mechanical, right? So the sphere of the Earth is mechanized. The biosphere was a deliberate reaction against that with the rise of the Green Party and ever since the energy crisis of the 70s to return to the Earth.
But also Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, right? That one played a huge role.
Yeah, and the noosphere came from thinking about the information age as a consequence of the decline of the machinic age. And this happens in design. A lot of design schools now, you spend time designing systems that design things, or you design services. Very few design schools make objects anymore, or they do. It's a small minority of what they do. But the noosphere has to do with something like a hive mind or a collective consciousness, which might have a collective unconsciousness, if Jung is correct. And then the aerosphere was something in that chain reaction or billiard reaction that had happened through intellectual history that in many ways was a trick shot. And I'll leave it at that and let my colleagues explain the project.
It began with a simple question, actually, around, and it was a world building project at its core, right?
Yeah.
So it operated within world building theory fiction, but it was also theory fiction for spatial installation, is how we arrived. And it had only one question at its core, which was what forms of love are available to the built environment?
But also, what if we did not have to solve this economically? So it was actually initially conceptualized as a conversation. So it was for reimagining museums against climate action. And one of the things was that the entire climate action conversation is in vocabulary and in language. Again, bringing us back to some of the things that we addressed in this today was that it is language that is not accessible. And the installation essentially came about the way we designed it was almost like as a parody of a climate change expo. That what happens if there's an organization in the universe or in the interdimensional universe that deploys agents called aerospheres out into the world, and the current agent that we have is Captain Capitalism. So we also came up with a bunch of really funny and nuanced characters that played roles in shaping the universe. And our recent one was supposed to be Neuros, who brought with it a conversation of love and the hybrids of love in language to describe I think the conversation.
Yeah, but now when the way you put it also reminds me of the understanding of eons that we have in Indian mythology, where there are 4 major eons. And centuries and millennia are part of each eon, right? And these aerospheres as agents, like when we say the time of capitalism is up, it's not, but it should be, it has to be.
Getting close.
But so it's also when you change one thing about a world, what else changes? So if you shift the conversation to thinking of love, like if we don't have to solve the climate crisis economically, but through love, what would those solutions also look like, right? So the expo, the installation was going to come with those narratives that, here's the recipe of, and love in all its forms. So, that's what Aerospheres as a project was about.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, this really connects you in a way to like also, I mean, when you talk about love and affect, you know, when you bring this as a way, as a lens, let's say, to think from, I mean, for me, it becomes a lot connected, I mean, to queering and, I mean, which is something that's very present, of course, or like in choreography and in, I mean,
Yeah.
performing arts and
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, very interesting.
Hi. Can I?
I'm
Can I ask a question
Oh, of
or like
course.
share some thoughts? Hi, I'm Akash. I'm sorry, I'm sitting in a dark room, so I can't turn on my camera. It's really late in the night here. Thank you so much. I think this was super interesting. I love science fiction, and I think this is a very pleasant surprise of a conversation. So thank you. I wanted to. So I've always read science fiction, or to me, my interest in science fiction didn't come from the alien side, but came from a point where I found them to be very interesting commentaries on the human condition.
Yeah.
You know, like the way that uh, post-apocalyptic imaginations of the world were always a reflection of of the kind of lives that we're living right now, or and not in like a preachy manner, but you know, like where um, they were almost like reminders of you know, very everyday kindness, very everyday. So I mean, your aerosphere project, for example, you know, where
Yeah.
you approach it through love, and I think that's such a brilliant you know, way of thinking about it, because community and love is probably the only tools that we have left, or the only places where we everyday people may have some power, right? In the whole capitalistic sort of machinery that we inhabit today. So now I'm trying to understand, or my sort of question to the entire team would be, um, what is it? Are there also narratives that you come across which which are like, for example, I always thought that. So I read all of Sayaka Murata, right? The books, Convenience Store Woman, Earthlings, and the third one. And for the longest time, I thought that they were science fiction, but they're actually literary fiction. And so there's also this interesting sort of way in which the genre gets defined. So I'm wondering if there are thoughts or recommendations that you as a team have come across, or these conflicts of what becomes of science fiction that you've encountered, that you would like to sort of share. You know, Ursula Le Guin as well, for me, is more interesting for its politics, like its structure of anarchy. And
Yeah.
also, I mean, I can barely kind of remember the intergalactic terminologies, names, the planets and things. But for me, the structure that she builds within her writing is extremely fascinating. So I'm
Yeah.
wondering if there are these kind of ideas that you've had in your conversations, recommendations for taking this further, genre-based conflicts that that you've had.
actually, Akanksha, so, thank you. We were going to talk about science fiction and genre, actually. The fact that it doesn't have any, and
Yeah,
any conflict that we set up is, a false conflict.
exactly.
And
But
we
I
also
think,
discovered is there's a genealogy that, historically science fiction was also lowbrow literature, right?
yeah.
So there's also that kind of literary nature. So if you see, the works of, for example, Vanna Shiv or Manjula Padmanabhan, are what would now get classified as so-called high fiction. because of the incredible linguistic gymnastics.
Yeah.
But so, and what you pointed out about having read those volumes that you thought were science fiction and aren't, they
Yeah.
turned out to be something else. And Ankita and I were researching that, what are the Indian science fiction films? And we came across a bunch of films that we saw were
That we
classified
didn't
as
know.
science fiction, and they
We just thought they were Bollywood cringe, and we're like, hang on a minute. That's how
Johnny
they're.
Dushman.
So
for example.
anything from Aa Dekhe Zara to Mr. India to
Mr. India counts.
Mr. India counts fine. Then there's
Johnny Dushman, right? Johnny Dushman.
no, that's the level of high fantasy that I would not ever classify under
But it
science
is. I
fiction.
mean, when you look it up, it comes across as science fiction. It's
So,
ridiculous. I mean, I'm not.
yes. But that's the thing with the genre definition that you were saying, right? So what's wonderful about science fiction is that it's not a pigeonhole. It's not a pre-formed taxonomy. It's a tendency. And which is why these Bollywood films sort of get classified under that. And what, Ishita was saying about genealogy and about genre confusion is that more often than not, science fiction used to begin, or at least the early ones were all very exploratory adventure tales that I'm going to go, in another time, or I'm going to go to another world. And then towards the 60s and 70s, it became more about science being the primary component. So so all science fiction needed this, quasi-scientific framework within their narratives. Then it became, the self-aware science fiction that contemplates the effect of science on society. So all of these, I don't know if you've seen Black Mirror, which really talks critically about the experiences people have with technology today, even though the visual language presented within the TV show is slightly futuristic. And where we are currently is science fiction that's for social change and activism. So all these relations that you see with future thinking, it's science fiction that's trying to make a difference with the criticality it can offer.
But science fiction also changes with our relationship with science, because the science of today becomes the myth of tomorrow, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Magic still is, people don't know whether it's myth or if it's science, right? Or it's what we say, it's science that we don't understand yet. So yeah, I think the category confusion is where all the joy is, because you get to figure out for yourself, whether or not this is something that you would consider, at what level and what level of interpretation, which brings back again the idea of the novum from Darko Suvin, which might be a good sort of, line to follow up, which looks at the context of the authors and, the relational result that it has on the kinds of works they produce. So that might be a good follow through.
Okay. But sorry, if I may, just a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
I'm also thinking that the way that you're defining the genre right now is still very technology dependent or based, right? Like we're still looking at science fiction, but the books that I'm talking about the reason why I think they're not called science fiction but literary fiction is because there is no science. They are essentially, it's transformative without the help of technology.
It doesn't, so science doesn't necessarily mean technology.
So,
science once upon a time
exactly.
also used to be alchemy, right? Like I said,
Right.
magic is also a science. The idea of sorcery, the idea of, ritualistic practices, they're also potentially science.
Sorry, I was just asking that if there are any recommendations of this kind which are actually within the or popularly also categorized within the genre that you may have, like of books.
No,
that could be
so there aren't, and that's also from where I remember Ankita has been making a case that we need to bring different imaginations of science fiction, and
Right.
and the struggle for that, right? That why is, if science doesn't look like what we expect it to look, not called science, and as a result, something gets called literary fiction and not science fiction. So that is
fantasy. Of fantasy, you know. So one of the this case, actually, I can do it through an example as well, because there's instantaneous travel. Okay, now how that instantaneous travel happens, we don't need to know, but instantaneous travel happens in Harry Potter. It happens in Thor. It also happens in Star Trek. Now, all three of them are actually categorized. One is categorized as fantasy, one is categorized as science fiction, and one is categorized as, I think Thor is confused that which particular category, he belongs to, because there's also Norse mythology as a part of that, right? So there's qualities, there's actions that happen within science fiction that you can potentially try and explain logically. And that logical framework is wherein, more often than not, technology makes its way in, which it doesn't really have to or need to. And yeah, I think Signal read, but also, was it Sita's Descent?
but I was also thinking of, Zombistan, where
That's true.
yeah, so the fact that citizens were given vaccines. I mean, they were injected with things so that they became zombies of religious ideology and became zealots. Is transformation of it almost become when concepts become things, and it is in that almost that conflation that we see, right? So I think those are also some of the stories, but I don't think they qualify as popular by any means. But they're out there.
Yeah.
Can I add that when I first started studying science fiction, Blade Runner, cyberpunk, these dystopian visions of the world, which were distinctly anxieties about both the Cold War and the coming information age, were very different than the 70s dystopias, which in many ways were perhaps critiques of social orthodoxy and hegemony. Everything from Logan's Run to 2001, and then it flipped to a very dark vision of the future. And then dystopias go through another mutation in the early 21st century, where the dystopian futures all look like Apple Macintosh stores. These kind of seamless, textureless, completely automated environments, which has also become a type of reality. But there's a new emergent genre that I think it started in Brazil actually, called solar punk, that I've just started reading about, which looks at new social organizations, configurations, ecologies, not based on a specific social critique per se, but on what sort of future society would occur, what adventures would happen, and I'm oversimplifying it, in a non-petroleum based future. And so that's based on, there is a technology there, renewable energies, but the solar punk, the word itself, is also talking about that earlier cyberpunk approach, which was more Jew-guard, hacker culture, subversion of the orthodoxy. So I think there's also a lot of types of speculative fiction, or even some things in, I occasionally find things in, critical humanities, digital humanities, critical plant studies, that sound a lot like science fiction, but they're classified at a different shelf in the library too. So, I mean, the porosity of the genre is, in some ways asking us, and I can even think when I'm doing research on Guattari's schizoanalysis, he wrote a science fiction story too. After trying to do schizoanalytic practice in Brazil and in Japan, he wrote a science fiction film and tried to get Hollywood to produce it too. So, there's a lot of, I would say not frustration, but there's a lot of glorious crossovers into and out of the lane of science fiction, if we can talk about it that way. And here in India, no one stays in their lane.
I'm also thinking of the discourses around solar punk, right? Where they go all the way to Bataille's solar axis, and then through that enter the occult. Yeah,
they can. There's that kind of the origin of religion and excess, all tied to solar economies or solar ecologies at the same time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Akanksha.
So I just wanted to mention that there had been a question regarding Sultana's dream from Kriti, and that Ishita gave an explanation to this. So if anyone else was interested, you can read a little bit about that in the chat. And as I don't know, Corina, what do you think? As I don't see any more questions or contributions, maybe we should come to an end. If nobody else, Corina, you have to unmute yourself.
Yes, does anybody, I agree with you, but I have does anybody have a question? Because I would be curious about something in case nobody has a question.
I actually just wanted to point out that I really love the illustrations you use for your videos. And I wanted to ask about them, like where do they come from? Who did them? How were you inspired to make them that way?
So
Yes. May I just add one thing, because I had something that was connected to what Lena said. And actually it's a very simple, because the idea of a forest, basically, because it's something that I'm also very interested in. And I was just wondering, like, if this is something that was specifically for this, or if you work with, let's say, forest as a way of building tentacular thinking as a process. So yes, I just would like to know where the forest is at in your work, just to complete what Lena mentioned.
Yeah, I'll answer Lena's question. I'll leave the forest to Ishita, because but no, it came, the genesis of the forest has been, I think, long coming. We've been talking about it, but the tree is more descriptive of all three of us. And I'll let Ishita elaborate on that, but I'll answer to what Lena asked about the visuals. And so both me and Ishita really love working with composites or collages. So the entire, all the sequences that you saw were actually, the different ideas that we had that we sort of created together as composites. And all three of us had a role in sort of understanding that how do we want this tree to grow, what do we want it to say, because it's an abstract biography in a way of all three of us, where Ishita remains the hearth or the subterranean sort of the growth, the fertile space where both me and Thomas sort of come either as branches up out in the day to Thomas being a shape-shifting critter that comes in and then flies out again. So we sort of started talking about this I think a while back, when we were just trying to say that how are we contributing to this collective, and what positions that we all hold, what do we do, and how does it sort of cross-pollinate our thought processes, even though we have very, very, like, similar to our multi-arm thing, we have desires that take us in different directions, but also sufficient amount of overlaps that we want to continue doing this. But yes, a lot of composite visuals that we've sort of collected over a period of time and sort of put together to tell very specific stories.
Yeah, and the archives of those visuals have sort of grown over the years. They are artist works that one admires, and doodles that either have been made in a sketchbook, or book covers that have been. So there's that kind of materiality, almost a landscape, and this very, very found object kind of a way of compositing images as well. And this also goes back to the idea of the forest, because forest is also, there was never a time when there wasn't a forest. So and yet new things are born in the forest. And those new things are born off the forest too, right? So it also calls to the fact that we are always indebted to others that have come before us and done the work. And, granularities of those works always enter works that follow. So, that also sort of becomes the ethical core. The film clips were specifically made for today. So it gave us an opportunity to, crystallize this idea that we've been having only as conversations. But the forest as in space of imminence, space of wilderness, space for carnivalesque subjectivities, the forest as it appears in German Romanticism, the forest as it appears in Gothic imagination. But then 2 years ago, I was also teaching a course on a graphic novel written. It was sort of, the novel was about a forest, but it also became a forest in the process, where conversations, and I'll just type, it's a novel called Aranyak.
I'll put that in.
Okay. So Aranyak is also a forest, and it's a story about, it's a retelling. It's a retelling of a Vedic myth, where conversations of ecofeminism, forms of knowledge, feminist epistemologies, all of them come together to become the forest. So forest is both the site as well as method to, think about working. And it is not, we continuously go, and forest also in that sense offers us a safe space of reconciling with the fact that things happen in the dark that we can't see, and they will show themselves when the time appears.
Yeah.
And, so it helps us ground our faith in things that are not visible, but very much there.
But also access to very different kinds of time scales, right? So when we've been talking about liminal time spaces such as the twilight, or such as the dawn, and then the midnight and the high noon. So even again, from very Gothic and German Romanticist possibilities of time scales and time shifts that we ourselves sort of, face between the three of us, and how we see time very, very differently.
But also the growth model of the forest is something that we're also quite taken with, that, it doesn't, if it grows a certain way, then it very quickly becomes an orchard, right? So for a forest to be a forest, it grows, and when a forest grows, everything else grows with it. And when the forest dies, everything else dies with it. And, if you still go back to the mycelial networks that inhabit forest structures, they never die, even when the forest dies. And, the death of the forest brings about a new birth of the forest too. So it's thinking of the forest as a site and a space and a figure and a method. All of that sort of conflates in how we work with it.
Thank you. Okay, so would anybody else like to say something? Would anyone like to ask a question, or we can begin to close our session? Okay, everyone. So one thing that I'm very much willing to do is to have really a list of references in our documentation of this later in the documentation of this encounter, because I am sure that there are many things that could be super interesting to have access to, and that it would not be so easy for some of us to find. So I'm going to ask them about that later. And now I would like to thank you very much. Okay, so Ankita, Ishita, and Thomas for for this amazing sharing. It was super inspiring. And yes, thank you very much for joining this project. So it's really wonderful. And I mean, I'm glad that we had this opportunity to see your work, and we hope we are in touch and we can see more of what you guys are doing. And yeah, this is our last encounter of the project. Lena, would you like to say anything?
Also, a very big thank you to the three of you, Thomas, Ankita, and Ishita. It was really a lot of input in a really good way. So many ideas popping up. And I think I also said it in the last encounters that it's really fascinating how from these very different topics our guests bring, there is somehow a string that connects all the encounters. Like there are topics popping up that have been there in the other encounters. We keep coming back to trees, and we keep coming back to aspects of community, and in contradiction to individuals. And there are so many topics that, well, for me at least, like having been part of the other encounters as well, create connections. And I just wanted to comment again on the illustrations, because now that you explained them a little bit, I really could see that in them. Like during your presentation, I thought like, wow, these images somehow bring it together for me, because they had so many layers, and you were also talking about different universes and different worlds that we can create by telling stories. So it was a really lovely aspect that you added. So thank you so much for your whole effort of preparing this presentation, especially for us. It was really, really great to listen. And
but we'd also be now that you mentioned that, through all these encounters that you've had, you see emerging patterns of, like some recurrences. And we'd also be very curious to hear about how these encounters inform your project that started it all, right? And so if and when you do that, do count us in for sharing.
Yeah, but
yes.
We'd also really like to know that, you spoke about trees and communities coming back, and because you've seen all encounters, there's also different contexts within which these strings are coming back, right? And it'll be really nice if there's any way to sort of plot that for even understanding of individuals who may have, ended up speaking about same things, but in very, very different connotations. And whether or not there's any cross-pollination possible at that end, and also then, it coming back to you and your project.
Yeah, we kind of hope, of course, to do that a little bit through the documentation. Yep. But of course, the documentation also is supposed to be neutral, as we don't want to put our perspective on the things. It's merely, we want to try to deflect what has been given to us. But we will, of course, inform you as soon as the documentation is online. But it will also be a growing thing, we hope. And just for that, I just put our website and then our email address in the chat for everyone. And so we really hope that whenever something comes to your mind and you think of this conversation, we would love to hear stories or see pictures, or just to be able to feed this archive.
I think just relating to this question, I mean, I'm sure that there's a lot of cross-pollination and there are many things that come to mind. But the content is like, I mean, everything is so full that it would be hard to really talk about it just like, right? I mean, at this moment, but there are certain things which I could say now, for instance, that are that I think that came out very strongly, is because, I mean, like, of course, it's documentation. It's not that we are going to work, and I mean, of course, that, you know, we do it, so already our point of view is there, just in the way we place it. But of course, that, I mean, Bianca's not here. Two of us, we curated, you know, this, and it's our first work. It was our first curatorial work. But interestingly, this, I think I can say this about her as well, because we spoke about it, that we see this curatorial work as a sort of extension of our choreographic practice, you know? So basically, I mean, for us, it has been really fascinating, because, I mean, of course, we knew that it's going to be great, but it's been really incredible because we decided to invite people from different places and sort of create crossings that were not something that you would think at first. As I said, you guys were a little bit of a different proposition, because you guys are already in dialogue, no?
Yeah.
So sometimes certain things are surprising, like, for example, this foresting as a methodology, which is something that is related to other conversations, is something that I had no idea that would appear here, you know? So in the documentation, you see how this will be presented. And yes, I think that I would have to like think a bit to tell you more about that.
Yeah.
So I think I'm gonna end here. Okay. Because my head is full.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yes. And so we're closing now. So for I call spectators, participants, that's how I call them. So thank you very much. And yes, and we are going to be, of course, when the documentation will be online, we are going to post. So keep following us. Because yeah, I think that would be nice things to see from the conversations that you attended, and also from others that you did not. So thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for joining, and have a very lovely night.